Good evening, everyone. Tonight we begin with the quiet strength and remarkable endurance of medieval girls caught in the marriage market of the 1300s. Long before they could even write their names, many were already being weighed as potential. Alliances, their futures assessed not by dreams or desires, but by the size of their dowries and the stitch of their cloaks. Love had little to do with it. Their worth was tallied in bolts of cloth, coins, and livestock futures traded like goods at market. Before we settle in, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the stories I share here, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always a quiet joy to see where our little circle of listeners reaches across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's story together. In a small stone-walled chamber somewhere in northern Italy in the year 1324, a man carefully opened a wooden chest, its hinges creaking with age. Inside were papers, scraps of fabric, and most importantly, a ledger. This was not an account of crop yields or tax records, but something far more personal. It recorded the dowries he had assembled for his 3 daughters. This scene, repeated in manor houses, merchant villas, and even the homes of modest craftsmen, was part of a vast social mechanism that shaped female lives across medieval Europe. The dowry was not a gift of love or sentiment. It was a transactional requirement, often a girl's only ticket to marriage, stability, and security. In the 1300s, a dowry was as essential as a roof in winter. For families, especially those with daughters, it meant careful planning from birth. Girls were assigned monetary value from a young age. If a father had more than one daughter, he had to make difficult decisions, divide the estate equally and risk weakening the family's fortunes, or invest heavily in one daughter's future at the expense of the others. Often, the eldest daughter received the most attention, while younger sisters faced the prospect of a convent, or remaining unmarried in their father's home, dependent and silent. Dowries came in many forms. For wealthier families, gold and silver coins were the core, sometimes amounting to a third of a family's assets. Others might give land, livestock, textiles, or jewelry. In cities, a dowry could include valuable household items like imported ceramics or ornate bedding. For peasants, it might be a modest linen chest and a few sheep. Yet the expectation remained. A dowry had to be enough to tempt a husband, or at least satisfy his family. A girl with no dowry was not truly eligible, no matter how kind or clever she might be. The church, keen to regulate marriage, upheld the dowry system, while also trying to cap its excesses. Canon law warned against treating marriage as a pure business contract, but in practice, priests turned a blind eye to negotiations. A priest would bless a union, but he would never inquire how many florins had changed hands beforehand. Legal documents, on the other hand, recorded dowries with astonishing detail. In Venice, Florence, and Paris, notaries worked long hours drafting dowry contracts that read more like business arrangements than romantic promises. The contracts listed every coin, bolt of silk, and acre of vineyard, down to the last farthing. In some regions, the dowry was held in trust to be returned to the bride's family if the husband died prematurely. In others, it passed irrevocably into the husband's estate. This meant that the choice of husband was not merely personal, nor entirely paternal. It was financial. Families sought to marry their daughters into stability, not affection. If a man was of noble blood but land poor, he might seek a merchant's daughter with a rich dowry. If a merchant wished to rise socially, he might marry his daughter to a minor noble. In both cases, the girl's fate was the coin to buy status, protection, and future grandchildren. But what of the girls themselves? Most had little say. At best, they might be informed of the decision a few days before the ceremony. Some were allowed to speak to their future husband, supervised of course. A lucky few were allowed to express mild objections, but outright refusal was rare. The marriage contract was signed by men, fathers, uncles, brothers, and only witnessed by the bride. She might nod, curtsy, or utter a practiced yes. That was enough. It is worth noting that dowries could be a double-edged sword. A girl with a large dowry was sometimes seen as a target. Greedy husbands might marry simply to claim the money, then isolate or mistreat their wives. If the marriage failed or turned violent, the woman had little recourse. Divorce was not available. Annulment was rare and required proof of fraud, impotence, or consanguinity. Even separation meant years of negotiation and disgrace. The dowry, once given, was not always recoverable, especially if it had been spent or absorbed into landholdings. And so, for many women, the dowry became not a blessing, but a silent chain. Meanwhile, poor families faced an impossible choice. With no land or savings, they often scraped together small dowries through years of frugal living, borrowing from relatives, or offering household goods. In some cases, entire villages pitched in to help a girl marry, especially if her family was respected. Local lords might offer token gifts as a form of charity, but when that failed, many girls were sent to convents, not because of religious calling, but because there was simply no money for marriage. In this way, nuns were often daughters of poverty, not piety. The dowry system persisted for centuries, adapted and enforced by custom, law, and expectation. It shaped the rhythms of village life, the strategies of noble houses, and the silent calculations made at every family hearth. It transformed marriage into an economic proposition, one that could determine not just the future of a daughter, but the survival of a lineage. So as you picture that wooden chest in a shadowy room, with a father weighing scraps of parchment and counting coins by candlelight, consider this. What did it mean for a girl to know her worth was measured in florins and flocks? And how did these ledgers of dowries influence not just families, but the very fabric of medieval society? By the late 1300s, the dowry system, though still thriving, had begun to face new pressures. The plague had cut across generations, economic structures were shifting, and power no longer sat so predictably in the hands of a few noble families. The foundations of the old matchmaking model started to wobble. In some places, subtle cracks appeared. In others, outright defiance emerged. Daughters were beginning to speak. The Black Death's devastation in the mid-century had a paradoxical effect. While it caused immeasurable loss, it also created opportunity. With so many dead, there were fewer mouths to feed and more land to inherit. Inheritance laws were still male-biased, but widows, surviving daughters, and sisters of childless men often became custodians of land, shops, or livestock. A girl who had previously needed a dowry to be worth marrying now found herself courted for what she had already inherited. In several cases recorded in English manorial rolls, widowed fathers married off their landowning daughters not to gain status, but to secure alliances with trusted neighbors, people who could help manage and defend their thinning properties. This shift emboldened some women. In Siena, a merchant's daughter named Bettina refused to marry the man chosen for her, despite his wealth and title. She was 17 and had learned to keep her father's accounts after her brothers died of plague. When her father insisted on the marriage to stabilize the business, she reportedly threatened to leave the city and take the family's bookkeeping records with her. The marriage was called off. While Bettina's case was exceptional and likely aided by a shortage of clerical talent, it speaks to a growing pattern of subtle resistance. Girls no longer passive in the transactional web of marriage. Meanwhile, legal changes began nibbling at the authority of patriarchs. In some Italian city-states, reforms were introduced to protect a wife's dowry in case of debt or loss. Courts grew more sympathetic to widows and daughters, demanding the return of their marital property. In Barcelona, a 1389 statute required that all dowries be registered with the city so that corrupt husbands could not abscond with their wives' assets. Though these reforms were modest, they signaled a creeping awareness of the system's flaws. Even the church, long complicit in treating dowries as quiet prerequisites to holy matrimony, began to show concern. Papal decrees and sermons warned against excessive dowries, urging moderation and condemning marriages based solely on material arrangements. Some clerics argued that dowries cheapened the sacrament of marriage. Others remained silent, recognizing that without them, most unions would never be formed at all. In the shadows of cathedrals and courtrooms, women continued to be appraised by number, by lineage, by weight of coin. Still, change crept in. In the German states, the emergence of craft guilds gave daughters of tradesmen new leverage. a brewer's daughter, for instance, might bring both a dowry and a recipe, making her an appealing match in both the marital and commercial sense. In one documented case from Cologne, a father included his daughter's exclusive rights to a yeast strain as part of her dowry. The contract ensured that only her husband could legally use it, a rare case of a woman's skills being contractually valued alongside her assets. In London, records from the Mercer's Company show a rise in contractual betrothals, where daughters had input, sometimes informal, sometimes in writing, on their future spouses. While these did not negate the dowry system, they softened its grip. Letters and poems written by such daughters begin to appear in surviving documents, some cautious, others bold, revealing young women increasingly aware of their position and increasingly reluctant to be mere entries in a ledger. Yet resistance had its limits. Girls who refused to marry or lacked dowries were still often confined to convents. In some cases, they were forced into marriages with older widowers or relocated to distant estates to prevent scandal. Others found themselves part of dubious arrangements, like bride sharing, in which dowried wives were used to secure the labor or loyalty of multiple family branches. These practices, though rare, underline just how far the system could stretch when the math of dowry failed to align with the human cost. Still, stories of individual defiance continued. In France, a young woman named Jeanne disguised herself as a boy and fled her village to avoid a forced marriage to a man twice her age. She was caught weeks later working as a scribe's apprentice under a false name. Though punished, her tale became known throughout the region. Local legend held that she eventually entered a convent of her choosing, not because she was poor, but because she wanted freedom. By the end of the 14th century, the dowry system had not disappeared, but it had transformed. It remained an economic anchor of marriage, but its terms became more negotiable. Daughters of wealthier families gained greater say, while civic and religious authorities tried, haltingly, to impose fairness and constraint. The marriage market was still a market, but it was no longer fully opaque. The ledgers remained, but more and more, the girls being accounted for had begun to speak. Some would speak only in letters to friends. Some would pray quietly for different fates. Some would rebel. Most would comply. But none could escape the arithmetic of marriage in their time. So, as we close this story and fold away the parchment ledgers of 14th century families, consider how long the idea of a woman's worth being counted in coin persisted. And if we were to examine modern marriage customs with the same calm gaze, might we find that the ledger, though hidden, still exists in other forms? As we continue deeper into the machinery of medieval matchmaking, the quiet but influential role of the dowry reveals an even broader social ecosystem, one where marriage was not merely a private contract, but a public strategy. By the mid-1300s, the exchange of wealth through dowries had become not just a local custom, but a pan-European market governed by silent rules, traditions, and an emerging class of professionals, the marriage brokers. In regions like Tuscany and Provence, particularly among wealthier merchant families, these matchmakers operated with sharp calculation. They knew which families were seeking sons-in-law and which had eligible bachelors in need of a wife's fortune. Some brokers worked openly, even advertising their services within certain guilds. Others operated discreetly, whispering offers between benches in market stalls or during church festivals. A successful broker could earn commissions in coin, cloth, or promises of future trade. Their job was part informant, part negotiator, and occasionally part spy. In noble courts, however, it was often the women, mothers, aunts, and widows who handled matchmaking, with generations of connections and a deep understanding of dynastic strategies. They managed the subtle art of marital diplomacy. Unlike their husbands, who dealt in swords and treaties, these women dealt in daughters and dowries. They remembered who had fallen from favor, which estates were over-leveraged, and who had recently lost a wife in childbirth. They navigated a delicate web of expectations, where a daughter's fortune could elevate a family or bind it to ruin. In England, particularly after the Black Death thinned the population, the marriage economy grew more complex. Suddenly, there were fewer eligible men and a greater urgency to secure them. Dowries rose. Younger sons who might once have become monks or soldiers now became marriageable prospects, while daughters, especially those of newly wealthy families, were pushed toward alliances that promised even a sliver of landed respectability. The line between noble and merchant began to blur, and money, not blood, often had the final say. One lesser-known yet fascinating tradition emerged in 14th century Florence: the communal dowry fund. Managed by city officials, it allowed families to deposit sums into a public fund for their daughters' marriages. The money would accrue interest over time, with the intention that the daughter could retrieve it upon marriage. While this sounds charitable, it was also a shrewd civic control, ensuring the state could monitor who was marrying whom, when, and with how much money. In a city where reputation meant survival, the communal dowry fund was both a lifeline and a leash. Meanwhile, in rural areas across Europe, matchmaking was far more localized. Here, dowries were negotiated at parish festivals, over jugs of ale in inns, or at village dances. Fathers, sometimes with sons at their sides, approached potential in-laws with cautious conversation. In these tight-knit communities, everyone knew what a girl was worth, not just in coin, but in work ethic, fertility, and temperament. Gossip played a powerful role. A girl known for disobedience might fetch a lower dowry rate, while one known for her bread-making or patience with younger siblings could spark friendly bidding wars. Yet these arrangements also had legal implications. In many parts of medieval Europe, a dowry contract had to be formalized in writing, sometimes with witnesses. It included terms for repayment in case of widowhood, clauses about what would happen if the husband died without male heirs, and occasionally, specific instructions for how the dowry could, or could not, be spent. In some traditions, the dowry had to remain untouched by the husband, managed instead by trustees. In others, it was his to use freely, leading to frequent disputes when fortunes vanished and wives found themselves destitute. One striking example comes from a case in Avignon, recorded in the papal court archives. A young woman named Marie was promised to a minor knight in exchange for a dowry of land and livestock. But before the wedding, the knight learned that Marie's family had lost their holdings to debt. Furious, he broke the contract, and Marie was left unmarriageable, her name tainted in local memory. Her family sued, not for breach of promise, but for fraud. The court ruled in favor of the knight, solidifying the unspoken truth of the time. A girl's marriageability was not just about character or faith, it was about assets. But what about those without anything to give? Across Europe, a quiet crisis brewed for poorer girls. As towns grew and merchant classes rose, inequality deepened. Girls from poor families, especially widows' daughters or orphaned girls, faced near certain exclusion from the marriage market. Some became domestic servants, living in the homes of the very people they might have married had their circumstances been different. Others entered convents, as noted before, but not always willingly. There are records of girls running away, seeking refuge in other villages where they might pose as someone else or offer themselves as companions for workmen or guards. These cases, though rare, show the silent desperation that could haunt her. Girl whose dowry chest was empty, yet even for those who married well, the dowry could remain a shadow in their lives. In some places, a woman had legal rights to reclaim her dowry upon widowhood. In others, she had to petition the court or appeal to her husband's family. Dowries could be used to pay debts, settle lawsuits, or buy influence. There are cases where sons, upon reaching adulthood, tried to recover portions of their mother's dowries, believing it was theirs by right. In a system where everything a woman brought into a marriage was treated as property, questions of ownership never quite disappeared. And so, the dowry was more than a tradition. It was a lifeline, a trap, a currency, and a burden. It could elevate a girl into nobility or bury her in obscurity. It shaped not just who married whom, but how families planned their futures, how cities managed their populations, and how women were remembered or forgotten. But perhaps the most unsettling part of this history is not the practice itself, but how long it lasted. For centuries, across continents, dowries continued to define womanhood, often in silence, often unquestioned. Even today, in places where the formal practice has vanished, echoes of the ledger remain in how we measure worth, stability, and love. And so, one might wonder, when did this system begin to crumble? And what, if anything, replaced it. Imagine a long, narrow stretch of land in the English countryside, sometime around the year 1347. The fields are dotted with grazing sheep, the hedgerows carefully trimmed, and the air smells faintly of peat and wood smoke. At the heart of this modest estate stands a stone manor house, small by noble standards, but large enough to cast a shadow over the nearby village. The land, and all who worked it, belonged to Sir Geoffrey de Harbridge, a minor knight and local lord. His banners bore a faded blue crest, his debts were quietly mounting, and his only hope for maintaining his family's hold on this land now lay not in his sword, but in his daughter's marriage. The girl in question, Joan de Harbridge, was not yet 14. In medieval England, particularly among the landed gentry, the marriage of daughters was not a private affair. It was a tool, an extension of estate management. Fathers arranged matches, not because their daughters were ready for marriage, but because their lands were in need of protection. Property, not sentiment, was the language of alliance. If your manor was vulnerable, the surest way to defend it was not with arms but by wedding your heir or daughter to a neighbour. And if your neighbour happened to have a son of age and strength, then all the better. Joan's case was typical. Her father's estate bordered that of Sir William Ferrau, an aging widower whose son Edmund was 17 and already managing his father's accounts. There had been long-standing disagreements between the two households, minor boundary disputes, grazing rights, and the occasional quarrel over marriage payments owed decades before. But when Sir Geoffrey's crops failed 2 summers in a row, and several of his tenants fled after the plague, he realized that a marriage would secure peace, combine resources, and ensure Joan's future, though future, in this case, meant early motherhood and a life of domestic vigilance. Manor-based marriages like this one were not usually grand affairs. There were no city feasts or guild-sponsored processions. There were contracts, dowry statements, and priestly blessings. But, above all, there was land. Often, the dowry was not cash, but acreage, strips of fields, patches of forest, the right to collect tithes from certain tenants. In return, the husband's family would offer assurances of protection, support, and status. The girl's role in all this was to be fertile, obedient, and to outlive enough childbirths to secure an heir. Girls like Joan were raised to understand these expectations from the beginning. In manor households, daughters were taught to run kitchens, supervise servants, and manage linen inventories. They were trained in prayers, modest reading, and estate account keeping. But they were also taught silence, how not to speak during negotiations, how to wait for their name to be spoken, and how to kneel and say yes when the priest asked. If they consented, the ceremony would often take place in the manor's small chapel or in the parish church. Joan would likely have worn a gown of her mother's or a simple dress dyed with woad. Her hair would have been unbound, a sign of maidenhood, and covered with a veil after the ceremony. There would have been bread, roasted goose if the estate could afford it, and watered wine. A local musician might play, but the joy, if there was any, belonged to the fathers. The daughter, in this world, was the linchpin of rural survival. The implications of such a union extended far beyond the wedding day. By marrying Joan to Edmund Ferrau, Sir Geoffrey was not just gaining a son-in-law, he was entering into a new political alignment. Fields would be merged, taxes negotiated together, and tenants cross-managed. If the marriage produced sons, land boundaries might dissolve altogether. If it failed, if Joan died or remained childless, everything could collapse. And yet, for all its cold practicality, these manor marriages were not inherently cruel. Many teenage brides grew into powerful matriarchs. If they survived childbirth, they often became estate managers in their own right. Some widows inherited lands and remarried advantageously. Others oversaw the upbringing of their grandchildren and became anchors of local lineage. There was resilience in their lives. Quiet, persistent, often invisible. Still, Joan's path was fixed. Before her wedding, she would have received a modest trousseau, perhaps a wooden chest with embroidered linens, a few woolen cloaks, and her mother's rosary beads. Her dowry, agreed upon in whispers between Geoffrey and William, likely included 5 acres of fallow land, 2 dairy cows, and rights to the village oven for her new household. The priest would record the union, bless their bed, and see to it that the community accepted it. And Joan, at just 14, would step from her childhood chamber to the master's hall of another family's manor to begin her life as a wife. This was not uncommon. The average age of noble and gentry girls at marriage was shockingly low by modern standards, often between 12 and 15, while church law generally required both parties to be at least 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Exceptions were made when property was at stake. In practice, the consummation of the marriage might be delayed a few years, but not always. Fertility was expected early. An heir was needed soon. For these teenage brides, maturity came quickly. Pregnancy followed within months. Miscarriage, stillbirth and maternal death were constant threats. Yet the family line depended on their endurance. Their youth was not a liability. It was a strategy. The younger a girl was married, the more years of fertility she offered. And in a world where plague, war and famine claimed so many children, quantity mattered. The manor, the land and the family name were all riding on her narrow shoulders. But what did Joan think as she stood at the altar? What did she feel when her hand was placed in Edmund's and her father gave her away like a coin changing hands? The chronicles do not say. No one wrote down her words. She appears only in a line of property records. Joan, daughter of Geoffrey, married to Edmund Ferro in the year of our Lord 1347. Her voice is silent, but her legacy remains, buried in the fused fields of two once separate estates. What happened to girls like Joan after the wedding? How did they survive the early years of marriage, motherhood and manor life? Joan de Harbridge, now married into the Ferro household, awoke in a room that no longer smelled of her family's hearth, or the rosemary her mother used to steep in boiling water. Instead, there was the scent of old wool, beeswax polish, and damp stone. Her chamber in the Ferro manor was colder, larger, and lonelier than anything she had known. The marriage had been completed. Her dowry was settled, and at 14, she was now the lady of a new estate. For girls like Joan, the day after the wedding marked the start of not just a new household, but a new identity. Her name was no longer hers. She became known by her husband's family title. Her status attached not to her own merit, but to his estate. Her responsibilities, however, were vast. In the absence of her husband, who might travel, fight, or manage distant tenants, Joan was expected to run the household efficiently. This meant overseeing the kitchen staff, managing the linen and salt stores, checking accounts, maintaining relationships with tenants, and ensuring the manor was supplied for the coming seasons. Despite her youth, she was given charge over grown servants, hired reeves, and sometimes even elderly relatives of her husband. Her word, though often guided by custom or a steward's advice, carried the weight of the household. Should something go wrong, a fire, theft, or mismanaged grain, Joan would be blamed first. And yet, she had few legal rights to defend herself. Her authority was granted through marriage, not through law. Every morning began early. Before the sun warmed the fields, Joan would hear the bells from the chapel ring for lauds. She would rise, assisted by a servant, wash with cold water from a brass bowl, and dress in layered wool or linen. Her tasks began with prayers, followed by a walk through the kitchen to inspect bread making, then onto the storerooms, the fowl, pens, the weaving room. If her husband was home, she would dine with him privately. If not, she would sit at the long wooden table with other household members, offering silent blessings before eating. Midday brought correspondence. Letters from her father or her husband's cousins might arrive, sealed in wax. She could read, barely, and would rely on her steward or chaplain to help with anything complex. In many manor houses, the lady was the central communicator, sending orders, managing trades, and negotiating the delivery of salted fish or wine. She had to know the names and habits of those who worked the land, who harvested the barley, who owed rent in kind, and who had recently lost a husband to illness and might now fall behind in their dues. In times of peace, the manor's rhythm was predictable. In times of war, or plague, or drought, Joan's life became survival management. Grain had to be rationed. Sick tenants had to be isolated. In the absence of her husband, she would stand before village meetings, shielded by a steward, but fully visible to the community. Every decision she made would ripple through the estate, and yet her position remained precarious. Legally, Joan could not own property independently. Everything she managed still belonged to Edmund, her husband. Should he die without a male heir, Joan would be entitled to a dower, typically 1/3 of the estate's lands, but only if her marriage had been properly documented and if no legal challenge was brought against her. If Edmund's family disliked her, or if there were questions about her fertility, they might pressure her to remarry quickly or retreat to a nunnery. Some widows became pawns again, passed into a second marriage within months to settle another land dispute. And yet, there were women who defied this fate. The Lady Eleanor of Norfolk, a well-documented widow of the late 1300s, managed to retain her late husband's estate by forming direct ties with local clergy and landholders. Her carefully kept records, frequent gifts to the church, and political savvy earned her a kind of autonomous power, rare for the time. She never remarried. Instead, she operated as de facto lord of her manor for over 2 decades. Women like Eleanor were exceptions, but they were real, and their stories whisper from the margins of manorial roles, often dismissed as anomalies, yet hinting at a more complex reality. Back in the Ferro estate, Joan's duties would have shifted with the seasons. Spring brought lambing and the planting of oats. Summer required supervision of haymaking and the vegetable garden. Autumn brought the harvest and the long days of threshing and storage. Winter meant accounting, preserving meat, mending tools and preparing for snow. In each season, Joan was expected to ensure that the manor did not fail, not just economically, but spiritually and socially. She also bore children. Most girls her age were pregnant within a year of marriage. Fertility was both a duty and a threat. Medieval medicine was uncertain, and childbirth was fraught with danger. A girl might deliver in a cold chamber with only a midwife, a servant, and her prayers. The mortality rate was high, yet the pressure to produce a male heir was relentless. A son secured the estate. A daughter meant more future dowries to pay. There are many recorded cases of girls who died before their 17th year after bearing 2 or 3 children. Their names appear briefly in burial registers, sometimes accompanied by short Latin notes. Died in childbed, fever after delivery, wife of Sir Edmund. Their identity as a landholder's wife remained. Even in death, their own name blurred beneath layers of titles and transactions. Still, not all stories end in tragedy. Some manor wives, through survival, intelligence, or sheer endurance, became the memory keepers of their line. They advised their children, arranged marriages, tended to village disputes, and preserved the small dignity of order in a world that rarely afforded them control. They were not celebrated in song, nor recorded with detail in chronicles, but they shaped the very fabric of their manners through labor, consistency, and quiet command. And as Joan's life continued, through pregnancies, prayers, and harvests, she, like countless others, would fade from the written record. Her name might be engraved on a stone slab in the chapel. Her children might remember her as gentle, or stern, or simply as mother, but history would not with detail, not with care. So we are left to ask, did Joan ever come to love the land she married into? Did she find meaning in the duties that consumed her? Or did she sometimes wake before dawn, recalling the warmth of her old home and wondering what might have been had she not been born a daughter of a manor? Joan de Harbridge would have grown older with the land. Year by year, her hands would learn the language of harvests, her eyes the signs of sick livestock, her ears the patterns of servants' speech. In time, the girl who once stood silently at the altar beside Edmund Ferro would become the quiet center of the household, a figure both seen and unseen. Her authority grounded in routine more than title, in endurance more than affection. But what happened to women like Joan in the long term? After the wedding, after the first children, once the years settled into something less frightening and more ordinary? Most manor wives aged into their role slowly but permanently. Those who lived beyond childbirth and survived the frequent sicknesses of medieval life often became respected, if not entirely independent, figures within their communities. If Joan bore sons, she would have eventually stepped back from daily affairs, allowing her eldest to shadow his father, while she shifted into the background, supervising servants and minding the spiritual care of the household. If she bore only daughters, she faced the burden of securing dowries for each of them, retracing the path she herself had walked so young. Her life, in this way, became cyclical. She repeated the patterns passed down by her mother, the storage of salted meats in clay jars, the timing of lambing and spinning, the soft gestures of hospitality offered to visiting clerics or distant cousins. Her value was no longer measured in coin or contract, but in her ability to sustain. She managed fatigue as skillfully as she did linen. She negotiated peace between squabbling servants, soothed sick children with boiled herbs, and lit the chapel candles even when her knees ached. There were still dangers. If her husband died early and left no male heir, Joan could find herself vulnerable. Despite years of loyalty and work, medieval law offered little security for widows unless explicitly written into a marriage contract. She might be granted a widow's portion, known as dower rights, usually a third of her husband's lands or income, but enforcing those rights could be a long and humiliating ordeal. In some cases, widows were quickly married off again, their wills and preferences ignored. Other women, more fortunate or more feared, were allowed to remain on the manor as dowagers. In that role, Joan would have wielded influence over the kitchen, chapel, and sometimes even over her grandchildren. Her word would carry the weight of memory. She had lived through famine, childbirth, and feuds. She knew every hedge, every habit, every hidden fault in the soil. But even in this more respected role, Joan remained legally dependent. If her son wished to reclaim the dowager's lands, or if a more powerful noble sought to challenge the inheritance, her status could unravel. That dependency, quiet, consistent, exhausting, was the backdrop of every manor wife's existence. Authority, when it came, had to be constantly negotiated, never assumed. And yet, some of these women left traces. In the records of Winchester, for example, a woman named Marjorie Le Wateret managed her manor for over 20 years after her husband's death, collecting rents, overseeing legal disputes, and even sponsoring repairs to the parish church. In Yorkshire, Dame Alistair Brampton signed a series of agreements with local abbots to protect her rights as a widow, securing not only her land, but the future marriage contracts of her granddaughters. These women, though rarely recognized by chroniclers, quietly ensured that rural society did not collapse. They held together the threads of villages, estates, and kinship networks. They preserved continuity through war, disease, and political chaos. Their labor, often unacknowledged, shaped the generational survival of entire lineages. For some, there were moments of private happiness, a warm cup beside the hearth, a child's laughter, a husband who listened more than barked. For others, there was only fatigue. And for nearly all, there was the reality that their life had been arranged for them long before they understood its meaning. By the time Joan de Harbridge was 50, if she lived so long, she would have likely buried her husband, perhaps a child or two. She may have remained in the manor she entered as a girl bride, or been relocated to a smaller cottage near the chapel. She may have prayed daily for peace and salvation, believing deeply in the value of her labor, or she may have carried a quiet bitterness, never spoken aloud, never recorded in ink. The story of manor wives like Joan is not one of dramatic triumphs or rebellions. It is a story of adaptation, of learned endurance, of long winters and slow changes. It is a history without heroes, and yet it is vital. Without these women, the medieval manor, the core of England's feudal economy, would have crumbled. Behind every lord's title stood the unseen management of a woman who, more often than not, was married before her voice had fully changed and expected to run an estate before she had finished growing. So as we walk through the stone ruins of old manors, gazing at crumbling hearths and weathered walls, it is worth pausing to imagine the girls who were married into those homes, who cooked there, who bled there, who whispered lullabies and stored wheat, who never chose the place, but came to know every corner of it. And we are left to ask, when the records end and the stones fall silent, how do we remember the lives of those whose only recorded legacy was a marriage that kept a field intact? In the dusty corridors of medieval cities, behind guild halls, beside merchant stalls, in the side chapels of cathedrals, worked a small and largely unrecorded class of people who shaped the very structure of family, fortune, and fealty. They were not clergy, not nobles, and rarely household names. Yet their power, exercised quietly and persistently, moved daughters like chess pieces across the map of medieval Europe. These were the matchmakers, sometimes formal, often informal, and always essential. To understand their role, we must begin in the bustling quarters of a 14th century city like Bruges or Florence. These were hubs of commerce, where merchant families grew rich through wool, spices and banking, but remained desperate for legitimacy in a world still ruled by bloodlines and noble crests. Wealthy but unentitled, they sought to marry their daughters into declining noble houses whose fortunes had waned, but whose names still carried weight. This delicate exchange, coin for prestige, required expert facilitation. Enter the matchmaker. In the wealthier districts, particularly among Italian city-states, these individuals were often women, older, widowed and well-connected. They moved easily between households, carrying news, rumors, and proposals. They were discreet, highly observant, and trusted by families to know which sons were of age, which daughters had dowries ready, and which households were secretly drowning in debt but pretending otherwise. In Florence, matchmakers were sometimes registered with the city. They might also work within or adjacent to established guilds. Though there was no guild of matchmakers officially, many operated under the umbrella of mercantile or notarial guilds. Their work involved consulting ledgers, social calendars, and church records to determine legal eligibility and familial connections. Consanguinity, marriage between close blood relatives, was strictly regulated by canon law, and a matchmaker had to be sure that no such impediments would void a union. For noble families, the process was more theatrical, though still quietly controlled. Daughters were rarely allowed to speak directly to potential husbands. Instead, negotiations occurred between fathers, uncles, or even legal representatives. The matchmaker, in these cases, was less an introducer and more a fixer. They ensured that expectations were aligned, that the dowry was deemed sufficient, and that any moral or financial blemishes on either side were quietly dealt with. In some regions, there were men who specialized in these arrangements, often former clerks or retired stewards who knew family lineages like the back of their hand. In Paris, a former cathedral accountant named Etienne the Wise was reputed to have arranged over 70 noble marriages in the span of 2 decades. He kept a book, not for love notes, but for debt records, land appraisals, and inheritance disputes. That book, and his memory, were his tools. The matchmaker's role extended beyond just sealing the match. They advised on wedding timing, location, and who should be invited. In some traditions, they helped select the priest, negotiated the bride's trousseau, and even oversaw the exchange of symbolic gifts, rings, belts, brooches, meant to formalize the engagement. They might coach a bride on how to behave, what to say, and how to survive her first days in a stranger's house. And they were paid, not just with coin but with influence. A successful matchmaker might receive a bolt of velvet, a small parcel of land, or the lifelong loyalty of an entire family. In return, they were expected to protect the reputation of those involved. A failed match, where one party backed out, or a dowry was revealed to be smaller than promised, could ruin their credibility. Reputation was currency. Of course, not every marriage they arranged was between nobles and merchants. They worked across classes. In rural towns, they helped widowers find new wives quickly before harvest. In cities, they negotiated second marriages for childless men, or brought together cousins in borderline legal unions designed to keep property consolidated. Sometimes they were called to fix problems. A nobleman might seek a discreet match for a daughter rumored to have had a romantic entanglement. A merchant might need to marry quickly after a scandal involving bankruptcy. The matchmaker knew which families were desperate and which would overlook dishonor in exchange for silver. They kept secrets like priests and traded names like commodities. One of the most fascinating examples comes from Genoa in the 1370s. A woman named Agnese di Lorenzo was known for arranging cross-border marriages between wealthy Genoese merchants and minor Spanish nobility. She never married herself. Instead, she lived alone in a modest home near the docks and received visitors at odd hours. Her records, discovered centuries later, reveal a meticulous knowledge of dowries, inheritance laws, and social customs across half a dozen cities. She arranged over 30 marriages in her lifetime, each a thread that tied her city to a wider Mediterranean network. But their influence, however vital, was always fragile. Should a marriage sour too visibly, should abuse, annulment, or infertility bring scandal, the matchmaker might be blamed. They could be shunned, fined, or even excommunicated if accused of arranging unlawful unions. Their work walked a narrow line between legal, moral, and social acceptability. And the girls? They rarely met the matchmakers who changed their lives. These figures operated in the background, like shadows against the wall of a brightly lit room. A girl might hear that a proposal had come. She might be told that her father had approved the terms. And then, a few weeks later, she would be married. If she was lucky, her match would be kind. If not, there was little she could do. So we must wonder, what drove these matchmakers? Were they caretakers of social order, opportunists, survivors of the same system they helped sustain? And in a world that left little room for women to operate independently, was this role one of rare power, or simply another form of service cloaked in subtlety? Once the initial proposal was agreed upon in principle, often through a mix of whispered negotiations, subtle gestures, and cautiously phrased letters, the real work began. The matchmaker's quiet presence gave way to a flurry of legal, financial, and clerical activity that transformed a suggestion into a binding social alliance. In this phase, the matchmaker became more than just an arranger. They became an interpreter of law, a reader of custom, and in some cases, the only person keeping a noble house from collapse. This part of the process revolved around one critical document, the marriage contract, drawn up by notaries, men specially, trained in legal phrasing and inked precision. The marriage contract was far more than a mere announcement of intent. It was a complex ledger of social, financial, and territorial transactions. In Florence, Venice, Avignon, and other city-states, notaries maintained entire archives dedicated solely to marriage pacts. Families preserved these documents like holy relics, and matchmakers studied their terms with unrelenting attention. The contract laid out the dowry, exact sums, goods, or properties. It detailed payment schedules and inheritance clauses. It named guardians in case of death. It sometimes included conditions for annulment, especially if there was concern about fertility or legitimacy. For noble families, it also specified the transmission of titles or feudal rights, some of which dated back centuries and were contested in courts across generations. But the most sensitive clauses were those concerning scandal, any rumors of past indiscretions, prior betrothals, or disputed lineage. Here, the matchmaker's skill as a negotiator came to the fore. If a bride had a questionable past, the matchmaker might secure wording that emphasized her piety or the purity of her upbringing, omitting any mention of prior engagements. If a groom's family was in debt, the contract might include conditional dowry clauses that protected the bride's assets in case of bankruptcy. These negotiations were quiet, delicate, and often conducted through messengers or trusted clerics. One misplaced phrase could insult a family's honor. One overly ambitious clause could delay the union for months or drive the other party to withdraw entirely. The matchmaker often stood as the sole bridge between two houses too proud or too cautious to speak directly. Once signed, the contract was read aloud in the presence of witnesses, sometimes publicly. This act, binding in the eyes of both, the church and the local civil authority, marked the real beginning of the marriage, even before the priest's blessing or the couple's physical union. In fact, it was not uncommon for couples to be legally married on paper for weeks or even months before the wedding ceremony itself occurred. In some cases, these contractual arrangements never resulted in actual marriage. A sudden death, a changed alliance, or a better offer might break the arrangement. But such actions were dangerous. A broken contract could bring dishonor, lawsuits, or worse, social ostracism. Girls who were betrothed but left unmarried could suffer permanent reputational harm. They were referred to in some documents as desponsata non consumata, betrothed but unclaimed. And so, the matchmaker had to ensure not only that the contract was complete, but that the marriage actually happened. But even after the marriage took place, the matchmaker's job was not always done. In noble circles, especially among the Italian merchant elite or French minor aristocracy, the matchmaker might continue advising the families, particularly when it came to resolving disputes or managing dowry returns. If the husband died young, the matchmaker could act as mediator to ensure the widow received her rightful property. If infertility arose, the matchmaker might quietly consult with clerics or physicians to explore options while preserving the family's dignity. In one recorded case from Bologna in 1392, a matchmaker named Benedetta de Rossi was summoned years after a marriage she had arranged. The wife had not borne children, and the husband's family was threatening annulment to recoup the dowry. Benedetta appeared before the city magistrates, testified that she had confirmed the bride's health before the union, and persuaded the court to grant the wife a grace period. She was not merely an agent of arrangement, she had become an advocate. This subtle power made some matchmakers indispensable. Their knowledge extended beyond genealogies into the hidden world of favors, secrets, and social maintenance. They knew which priests were sympathetic, which notaries could be persuaded to revise clauses, which rumors to suppress, and which to amplify. Their words could raise or ruin a household's standing. Still, they walked a fragile line. Their success depended on invisibility. A matchmaker who became too public or too wealthy risked becoming a target, especially if a marriage turned sour. Failed matches brought consequences. A girl who was abused, cast out, or accused of barrenness could become a haunting mark on a matchmaker's record. In one tragic case from Avignon, a girl named Isabeau was married to a minor noble who turned out to be violent and unfaithful. Her family blamed the matchmaker, who was subsequently fined by the local court and barred from arranging further unions in the region. Thus, most matchmakers chose discretion. They worked in side rooms, under the cover of servants, behind the public faces of male authority. Their notes were often oral, their records sparse, their names barely mentioned. Even when their work ensured political alliances, averted feuds, or prevented bloodshed, they remained unnamed. And yet, the marks of their influence are everywhere. In dowry lists preserved in city archives, in the legal Latin scrawled across parchment margins, in the family trees that stretch from village manors to ducal courts. Their fingerprints shaped generations, unseen but indelible. So when we trace the elegant arc of a noble marriage, the banners, the vows, the jewels, we must ask, who stitched it all together? Who navigated the feuds, the debts, the inconvenient truths? And what did they sacrifice to keep their names out of the stories they helped create? As the marriage procession wound through cobbled streets or over muddy village roads, with banners flapping and voices lifted in prayer or polite laughter, few among the gathered crowd would have spared a thought for the person who had orchestrated it all. The bride, perhaps no older than 15, might glance nervously at her new husband. The father might smile with tired satisfaction. The mother whisper instructions or blessings. But the matchmaker, if present at all, would remain behind the scenes, already thinking of the next match, the next fragile balance of land, title, and dowry to be weighed. This was the enduring paradox of medieval matchmakers. Though essential to the preservation of power and property, they operated in deliberate anonymity. They were not chronicled with the same reverence as knights or abbots. Their influence was indirect, their success judged by the silence that followed. A marriage with no scandal, a union that bore heirs, a dowry that remained undisputed. But despite this invisibility, matchmakers shaped dynasties. Consider the webs of intermarriage that bound noble houses together across centuries. The Plantagenets, the Capetians, the Visconti, the Trastamaras, all relied on marriages to secure land, cement treaties, or outmaneuver rivals. And behind nearly every one of these strategic alliances, from the smallest rural manor to the greatest court of Europe, there was someone, often unnamed, who brokered the deal. They did so by cultivating deep wells of knowledge. They memorized who had fertile land but failing sons. They knew which families had quietly sold off heirlooms to appear wealthier than they were. They understood the subtleties of titles, what was inherited, what was ceremonial, what could be passed through. A daughter's child if written just so. This wasn't matchmaking as romance, it was matchmaking as warcraft. And like any good tactician, the matchmaker knew when to act, when to wait, and when to disappear. There were risks, the most dangerous of which was ambition. Occasionally, a Matchmaker overreached. Perhaps they proposed a match too bold, pairing a daughter of new merchant wealth with a noble family still clinging to old pride. Or they attempted to profit too much from a union, demanding a large commission or side payment. In such cases, their name might be dragged into legal disputes, or worse, ecclesiastical hearings. The church, though tolerant of arranged marriages, was increasingly wary of anything that resembled commodification of the sacrament. Matchmakers had to walk carefully, never appearing to sell marriage, always presenting it as a facilitation of God's will. Some sought protection through patronage. In late 14th century Florence, several matchmakers worked under the unofficial shield of wealthy merchant families, operating from their palazzi and receiving room, board, and modest stipends. In return, they arranged matches that preserved the client family's social elevation. One such woman, known only as Maddalena delle Nozze in tax documents, arranged marriages for at least 5 branches of the Albizzi family, helping them entrench their position against their Medici rivals. Others operated through religious institutions. Convents, particularly those serving elite girls, often liaised with discreet matchmakers to arrange marriages for young women who were not destined for religious life. These women, having been educated in Latin, embroidery, and courtly manners, were considered prime candidates for noble households, especially those seeking a wife of refinement, if not significant dowry. Matchmakers served as the go-between, passing inquiries to the abbess and communicating conditions to the family. It was another web, hidden within stone walls. And what of the matchmakers themselves? Most left no direct legacy. Their names, if recorded at all, appear as witnesses on marriage contracts or scribbled in a clerk's margin. A few letters survive, offering glimpses of their tone, formal, cautious, rarely personal. I trust the lady is of good disposition. The dowry has been confirmed by her uncle, though the land may not be fully cleared. The youth is tall and not given to drink. These are the voices of women and men who understood the power of precision. They did not embellish. They managed expectations. They spoke in terms of suitability, never desire. Some were unmarried, others widowed. A few worked in pairs, sisters, mother-daughter teams, even clerics who used their education and neutrality to negotiate across feuding factions. Their compensation varied. In cities, it might be coin or a cut of the dowry. In rural areas, it might be livestock, a bolt of cloth, or permanent exemption from certain dues. But more often, their reward was reputation. To be a trusted matchmaker was to have influence without a sword, access without scandal. And yet, their labor was heavy. To hold in one's memory the histories of dozens of families, to navigate the tensions between ambition and pragmatism, to help a girl prepare to enter a life she had not chosen. This required stamina, emotional restraint, and a level of social dexterity rarely attributed to women or low-born men in the chronicles of medieval Europe. In rare instances, matchmakers intervened to prevent disaster. A document from Rouen in 1384 reveals a matchmaker advising a father against marrying his daughter to a nobleman who had previously bankrupted his wife's family. The matchmaker's warning, backed by written testimony and support from local merchants, led to the marriage being cancelled, saving the girl's dowry. She was later married to a respected vintner. The matchmaker's name is lost, but the parchment survives. So the next time one reads of a noble marriage forged for peace, of a dowry that saved a manor, or of a girl who rose unexpectedly through marriage, consider the hands that arranged it all. Not the fathers, not the priests, but the quiet figures who watched from the edges of banquet halls, memorizing bloodlines and fortunes, listening to gossip and converting it into action. They were the unremembered engineers of society, and though they left little behind, they shaped everything. But as their world changed, through plagues, reform, and the shifting tides of power, what became of these matchmakers? Did their skills vanish with the feudal world, or did they evolve into something else entirely? It was not unusual for a girl in medieval Europe to be engaged before she had learned her letters. In a dim stone hall, or beneath the wooden beams of a manor kitchen, a father might lean across a table and quietly promise his daughter, aged 7, perhaps even 5, To the son of a neighboring landholder or fellow guildsman, there would be no ceremony, no white gown or music, just a few firm words, a handshake, and the knowledge that a child's future had just been drawn like a circle on parchment, sealed, before she had the voice to question it. Betrothal in the 1300s was a legal and social instrument that extended far beyond the bounds of personal readiness or emotional maturity. The idea of an appropriate age for marriage was not measured by biology or feeling, but by law, custom, and utility. Canon law, which governed the sacrament of marriage in much of Christendom, set the minimum age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But these were minimums only for consummation. Betrothals could, and frequently did, occur earlier. The Church's concern was that marriage be entered into freely and without coercion, but it often accepted a child's verbal consent, particularly when it was ratified by their guardians. In the records of rural France and northern Italy, there are dozens of examples of child betrothals sanctioned with formal documents and witnessed by clergy. These arrangements were binding, even if they might be broken later by mutual agreement or exceptional circumstance. Still, once spoken and sealed, the promise carried weight. Why so young? The reasons were rarely emotional. Betrothals were about timing, inheritance, and the preservation of alliances. A girl born to a family with significant property might be betrothed early to secure the future management of her dowry. A boy born into a rising merchant house might be promised to a land-poor noble family in exchange for title and future placement. In these arrangements, the child's body was not the concern. Her name was, her blood, her connections, her legal usefulness. In wealthier families, these early betrothals were treated like long-term investments. The daughter might remain in her family home until adolescence, or she might be sent to live with her future in-laws, a practice known as fostering. There, she would be raised among the family she would one day join, trained in their customs, observed for temperament and obedience. Fostering was meant to create loyalty and familiarity, but it also reinforced that the girl's childhood was not hers alone. It belonged to two houses, not one. This meant that girlhood, for many medieval daughters, was not a time of exploration, but of preparation. Her tasks, lessons, and even play were directed toward readiness. In noble families, she would be taught embroidery, French or Latin prayers, household accounting, and religious songs. In merchant homes, she might learn to measure cloth, to write basic correspondence, to calculate coinage. Everything in her world whispered the same lesson: be useful, be agreeable, be ready. Of course, actual marriage, meaning the public ceremony, followed by the physical consummation of the union, might not happen for years. Some betrothals were broken, others were delayed. But the moment a girl was promised, her life changed. She was no longer available for other suitors. Her dowry began to be negotiated in finer detail. Her behavior became more closely watched. And as she neared 12, her body, still slight, still developing, became the focus of practical and often impersonal speculation. Was she strong enough for childbirth? Was she modest? Did she seem likely to bear sons? In peasant communities, the patterns were sometimes different. Girls there often married slightly later, 14, 15, even 17, not out of sentiment but because their families could not spare them sooner. Daughters were labourers. They worked the dairy stalls, harvested flax, and cared for younger siblings. Marrying them off meant losing a pair of hands. And while dowries in these communities were more modest, often a pig, a spinning wheel, or half a field, families still delayed as long as they could before parting with a child who provided essential work. Among the very poor, some girls never married at all. Without a dowry, they might remain at home, working as servants in wealthier households, or eventually entering convents if a spot opened. Others might cohabit unofficially with local men, forming unions unblessed by the church but tolerated by neighbours. These arrangements lacked the legal protections of formal marriage, and the women involved could face marginalisation, especially if children were born. But regardless of class, the concept of childhood as we understand it today, extended period of innocence and gradual preparation for adult responsibilities, simply did not exist. Childhood ended not at a biological milestone, but at a legal or social one. A girl might play with carved wooden dolls in the morning and be told that she was to marry the miller's son by evening. Once betrothed, she began to fade from the category of child and into that of bride. It is worth noting that not everyone approved of such early arrangements. Some clerics expressed concern over coerced marriages. A few legal scholars questioned whether children truly had the capacity to consent. Theologians debated whether spiritual understanding must accompany sacramental participation. But these were debates in cloisters and lecture halls. In the halls of manor houses and the homes of merchants, the decision had already been made. A daughter was a resource to be invested wisely. And what of the girls themselves? Their voices are mostly absent. They rarely wrote letters. Their prayers were spoken, aloud and forgotten. Their thoughts were often confined to the silence of routine, obedience and transition. We know them mostly through contracts and accusations, when a dowry was unpaid, when a marriage was disputed, when their worth was questioned in court. Still, some records offer glimpses of resistance. A petition from a girl named Aldegonde in Flanders around 1371 states that she was betrothed without full knowledge and wishes not to wed the man named. Her plea was unusual, but the bishop upheld it, declaring the betrothal invalid. In a world where most girls never spoke aloud their dissent, this document remains a rare breath of refusal. But how many more felt the same, silently watching as their futures were brokered in rooms they were not allowed to enter? So we ask again, when a girl was promised before she had lived half a dozen years, how could she know where her childhood ended and marriage began? By the time a girl neared the age of 12, the question was no longer if she would marry, but when. Her readiness was not measured in emotional maturity or understanding of partnership, but in signs far more practical: her ability to manage servants, her calmness in the face of instruction, her hips, her menses. In medieval Europe, the markers of womanhood were largely external, observed not by the girl herself, but by her mother, her father, and in many cases, the family's confessor or local priest. 12 was the canonical age. At 12, a girl could legally consent to marriage. She could be led to the altar, her hair braided and uncovered, her name written into a binding contract. The church's position, shaped by Roman law and centuries of canon deliberation, insisted that marriage required consent. But how that consent was gathered, and under what social pressure it was given, remained a murky and variable matter. For most girls, the consent was not loudly spoken, but softly implied: a nod, a glance, a silence taken as assent. In noble households, daughters approaching 12 were dressed differently. Their gowns lengthened, their veils became more structured. They were taught to walk with more reserve, to smile less, to speak less. Visitors were told of their age, their skills, and the value of their dowry, sometimes in the same breath. Suitors arrived with gifts for the family, hawking birds' bolts of silk or rings. A girl's preferences were rarely consulted, unless she was an heiress or unless the matchmaker considered her temperament difficult enough to interfere with the match. Even then, her will could be bent, and yet this readiness did not necessarily mean immediate consummation. In many regions, especially among elites, there was an unspoken understanding that marriage and cohabitation might be delayed. A girl might be married on paper at 12 or 13, but not sent to live with her husband until a year or two later, particularly if she appeared physically immature or medically vulnerable. Church authorities often look the other way in these cases, understanding the strategic need for early marriage while remaining uneasy about the physical risks of early childbirth. Those risks were considerable. Medical knowledge in the 1300s was limited, and childbirth was dangerous for any woman, especially a young girl whose body had not yet finished growing. Pelvic bones still developing could lead to obstructed labor, hemorrhage, or death. Midwives were skilled, but their tools were few, their remedies herbal and inconsistent. Girls who gave birth before 15 often suffered complications that would affect them for the rest of their lives, if they lived at all. Still, the expectation persisted. A wife, even a teenage wife, was to produce children, preferably boys. A girl married at 13 might be pregnant by 14, nursing by 15, and pregnant again by 16. Her life, once set in motion, followed a relentless rhythm, season after season, child after child, duty after duty. The cost was not just physical, it was social, emotional, and spiritual. Some girls, particularly those from pious households or with close ties to convents, were taught to view marriage as a divine calling, a holy burden. Priests instructed them in obedience and modesty. Mothers warned them of suffering, praised endurance, and reminded them that their own mothers had done the same. The language of survival was cloaked in the language of virtue. Submission was sanctified. Others were not so docile. A small number of girls, usually those with access to education or strong clerical connections, resisted their assigned marriages. They wrote to bishops. They fled to convents, claiming spiritual callings that allowed them to delay or avoid marriage entirely. These girls were exceptions, not the rule. But their stories, though rare, show that not all children accepted marriage as inevitable. In England, in 1382, a girl named Margaret Blount refused to marry the cousin her father had chosen for her. She was 15 and had spent several years at a Benedictine priory where she developed a taste for books and quiet. When brought home to prepare for her wedding, she allegedly feigned illness, refused to eat, and repeatedly requested to return to her spiritual family. Eventually, a local bishop intervened. Her marriage was annulled, and she entered the priory as a novice the following year. Such outcomes were rare and often required influence or luck. More often, a girl's refusal led to punishment. She might be locked in her chamber, denied meals, or brought forcibly to the altar. The law permitted such things, so long as a priest eventually received her spoken consent. Whether she meant it or not was considered a matter between her and God. Among the merchant class, the calculation of readiness took on different shades. A girl might be married off as soon as her father's business required a new alliance. Readiness was about family position and economic opportunity. In cities like Lübeck or Bruges, girls of 13 or 14 entered homes as wives and bookkeepers. Their readiness was judged not by physicality, but by steadiness. Could she handle the ledger, the staff, the customers? Was she clever, quiet, industrious? The urban world demanded different skills, but no less sacrifice. These girls bore the same physical risks, the same social constraints. They just wore better shoes and signed more receipts. What often gets lost in the statistics and case records is the internal life of these young brides. Their stories are told in passive voice, was married, was given, was brought to, as though these events simply happened to them, as though they were rooms being furnished or parcels being exchanged. The girl disappears into the narrative. She becomes a wife, a mother, a death date in a register. But we must remember that each of these marriages, no matter how customary or strategically arranged, altered the course of a life. A girl whose betrothal was arranged before she could write her name would grow into a woman whose choices had been made before she had words for them. And as she looked at her own daughter, maybe at age 6, 7, or 8, did she see another childhood vanishing under the weight of readiness? By the time a woman reached 30 in the medieval world, if she had married young, she might have been a mother many times over. She might have buried more than one child. Her own mother might be gone, and she, once a girl betrothed before her, voice had deepened, would now be the one preparing dowries, arranging matches, and watching for signs of readiness in daughters who had never known a world outside the path laid for them. What came after those early marriages was rarely peaceful. Life for a medieval bride, particularly one married before 15, was physically grueling and emotionally isolating. Those who survived early childbirth faced repeated pregnancies without adequate recovery time. Miscarriage, postpartum illness, and infection were common. Mothers-in-law often acted as enforcers of household customs, and servants obeyed reluctantly, especially when their new mistress was barely older than themselves. Some women adapted. They took comfort in their work, in their children, in the routines of kitchen, chapel, and garden. A young bride could become a competent estate manager by the time she was 25, especially if her husband was absent or preoccupied with business or war. Over time, she might earn respect from her household and even wield quiet influence in her village. Her survival depended not only on her health, but on her ability to navigate relationships and crises with discretion. But for others, the damage done by marrying too early was never quite undone. The chronic effects of obstructed labor, now understood as obstetric fistulas, could leave women incontinent, isolated, and ashamed. The psychological toll of being transferred from one household to another, of being expected to perform duties far beyond one's emotional or intellectual preparation, left marks too. Though rarely recorded in words, these effects were visible in behavior, in the withdrawal from family gatherings, in silence during feast days, in early death by despair or physical exhaustion. The church, for all its power, offered little recourse. A woman might seek comfort in prayer or the sacraments, but annulments were difficult to obtain, and separation required proof of cruelty, impotence, or invalidity of consent. Even when abuse was known or suspected, ecclesiastical courts often sided with the husband unless the woman came from a family powerful enough to make a fuss. And so, most suffered quietly, understanding that their suffering was not unique but expected. Still, not every story ended in hardship. Some early marriages developed into steady partnerships. A young wife and slightly older husband, matched well in temperament or supported by wise parents, might grow into their roles together. In a few cases, a woman's early start gave her an advantage later in life. Widowed in her 30s, she could remarry with more freedom, manage land in her own name, or enter a convent with substantial authority. Some even used their early marriages to educate younger girls, teaching them how to endure, how to negotiate, and how to avoid the worst outcomes. There were also legal shifts beginning to stir by the end of the 1300s. Some city-states experimented with raising the minimum marriage age. Others introduced formal consent requirements that required verbal affirmation from both parties in front of witnesses. These reforms were rarely enforced strictly, but they indicated a slow recognition that childhood marriage, while normalized, carried undeniable risks. In Florence, certain guilds began encouraging members to delay their daughters' marriages until 15 or 16, arguing that older girls were better prepared to manage merchant households. In England, some ecclesiastical courts began to reject marriage contracts made before puberty, unless the union had already been consummated. These developments were early and inconsistent, but real. Still, the broader culture remained resistant to change. Property, inheritance, and family prestige continued to outweigh personal development or emotional preparedness. Daughters were still measured by the alliances they could secure. Their childhoods, such as they were, still disappeared beneath the weight of familial strategy. And what of those girls who did not marry? Their lives were also shaped by this system. Some entered religious life by choice. Others were placed in nunneries as a way to avoid dowry expenses. A few lived with married siblings, tending to nieces and nephews, their own futures unresolved. These unmarried women, while often pitied or mocked, sometimes found freedom in their status. Without a husband, they could retain property longer, pursue education, or act as advisors to younger relatives, but they were still exceptions. Most remained peripheral, their lives shaped by decisions they did not make. Throughout the medieval period, the question of when a girl was ready to marry was not really a question about age. It was about usefulness, and usefulness was decided by men, fathers, brothers, priests, matchmakers. The girl herself, regardless of her inner readiness, was given no true choice. And so, generation after generation, the pattern repeated. Betrothal before understanding, marriage before consent, motherhood before adulthood. As we look back on these centuries of early unions, arranged not with cruelty, but with customary indifference, one cannot help but wonder how many girls knew they were never seen as children in the first place, and how different would the world have been if their voices had been heard. In a stone convent nestled among the hedgerows outside of Canterbury, a girl of 13 knelt in a cold chapel beside a linen-clad altar. Her hair had just been cut, thick auburn strands taken away by a solemn-faced prioress, and her fingers clutched a candle almost as tall as her thin frame. Behind her, older nuns chanted prayers in Latin. Before her, the small silver crucifix gleamed in candlelight. It was a moment of transition, but it was not yet final. For this girl, like many others of her time, entering the convent did not mean she had taken vows. Not yet. This was a probation, a pause, and often it was a waiting room for a marriage that might still be arranged. Throughout the 1300s, convents in Europe were filled not only with women seeking spiritual fulfillment, but also with girls who had been sent there by their families for reasons far more worldly. For noble and merchant households alike, The cloister provided a solution to a social puzzle: how to manage surplus daughters in a world where dowries were expensive, inheritance was limited, and marriage markets were complex. The cloister was shelter, it was storage, and sometimes it was a strategy. Many daughters entered convents not because they felt called to the religious life, but because their families could not afford to marry them off at that moment. It was not uncommon for a girl to live in a convent, from childhood through her teens, only to be summoned back out for a match arranged later, often with a widower in need of a second wife, or a younger man lacking inheritance but seeking a wife with modest expectations. This pattern, entry without final vows, was common and widely accepted. The church, though emphasizing the sanctity of religious life, permitted this halfway existence. The veil was not yet taken. The door was still open. Some girls found comfort in the quiet rhythm of cloistered life. They learned to read psalters, to illuminate letters, to garden in the abbey grounds. They grew used to the absence of male voices, to the softness of candlelight rather than firelight, to meals eaten in silence. But even in this seclusion, the outside world intruded. Letters arrived, visitors came, priests and confessors served as conduits for news and negotiation. The cloister, far from being a sealed sanctuary, was in many ways deeply embedded in social life. Monasteries and nunneries held land, managed tenants, and received donations from families hoping to secure influence or spiritual favor. A girl in a convent might become a bargaining chip, not in spite of her seclusion, but because of it. Her presence in the religious sphere could raise a family's standing. Her removal, when strategically timed, could seal an alliance. This dual identity made for uneasy transitions. Girls like the one kneeling in the chapel near Canterbury might one day find themselves called to leave. Their hair would be allowed to grow again, their embroidered veil replaced with a linen coif or braided coronet. The prayers they had learned would become private rather than communal, and they would be sent into households where the expectations were utterly different. Obedience, fertility, silence of a new kind. Some of these transitions were welcomed. For girls who had entered cloisters out of duty but longed for family life or companionship, the chance to marry was a form of liberation. There are examples in surviving letters, one from a girl named Isabel in Normandy, who wrote to her cousin about being freed from the quiet of the grey walls and looking forward to a house of warmth and children. Others were not so eager. A few tried to take vows quickly, hoping to seal their fate before marriage could claim them. Others wrote secret letters to avoid leaving. One girl, Marjorie de Rokesby, famously ran away from her betrothed the night before her wedding and returned to the convent from which she had been removed. The bishop allowed her to remain. The church's position on these movements was cautious. It affirmed the right of girls to choose religious life, but it also recognized the authority of fathers and guardians. A girl who had not taken final vows could be withdrawn, even against her wishes. And so, the liminal space between novice and nun became a battleground of family will, economic pressure, and spiritual longing. Convents, for their part, were not neutral. Some welcomed wealthy or well-connected girls, understanding that their presence brought prestige or future gifts. Others discouraged entry unless a dowry was provided. Yes, convents too required dowries, known as portions, paid to support the new members' upkeep. A girl without a portion might be accepted provisionally, but her future was never secure. She might be the first sent back if space was needed or politics demanded. Thus, many girls existed in a kind of social purgatory, betrothed to God by appearance, but still tethered to the worldly ambitions of their bloodline. They prayed at matins, but wondered if their hands would one day hold a husband's cup. They studied scriptures, but overheard whispers of marriages being arranged in halls they could not enter. The psychological toll of this waiting was subtle, but lasting. Some girls reported confusion and grief when removed from their religious homes. Others struggled to adapt to the roles of wife and mother after years of structured monastic life. The discipline that once shaped their days became constraint. The obedience that earned praise in the cloister became silence in a household. Their faith was expected to remain, but their freedom had shifted. And yet, in the broader pattern of medieval marriage, these girls played a crucial role. They were the reserve, the daughters who could be called upon when all others were matched or unavailable. Their marriages often sealed last-minute alliances or rescued families from legal or financial crises. They were rarely the first choice, but often the most flexible. And in that flexibility, they became instruments of social resilience. But what did it mean, in the eyes of a girl who had tasted spiritual purpose, to be drawn back into the obligations of marriage? Did she mourn the path not taken? Or did she, like so many others, simply accept the role shaped for her and walk quietly through a different doorway? For girls who lived in the in-between, those neither fully cloistered nor entirely free, their lives were a careful negotiation of identity. In medieval Europe, a girl in a convent without final vows walked a narrow path, her future suspended between two lives, one of silence, submission, and prayer, and another of marriage, motherhood, and service to household and lineage. At any moment, the decision could be made for her. What determined whether a girl stayed or was summoned from the convent varied from region to region and family to family. In wealthier households, especially among the merchant elite, daughters were sometimes sent to convents not as a permanent measure, but as a form of polishing, an education of sorts. There, they would learn decorum, reading, needlework, music, and prayer. This gave them cultural value in a marriage market increasingly interested in piety and grace. A girl who had spent 3 years in the convent was often considered more refined, more modest, and therefore more desirable. Families calculated these traits like coin. A daughter who emerged from a convent as a devout and educated maiden could command a better match than one raised entirely at home. This use of religious life as preparation for secular marriage reveals just how porous the boundaries between sacred and social obligations truly were. Still, not all girls in convents were waiting to be married. Many sincerely desired the religious life. Others grew into it, finding a sense of peace and identity within the rhythm of psalms and daily work. But the uncertainty lingered. Until final vows were spoken and the portion paid, a girl's future remained vulnerable to family ambition. This led to difficult moments. A young novice might find herself preparing to take vows one day and called back home the next. In some cases, the convent opposed the removal, especially if the girl had proven particularly obedient or gifted. But in most cases, families held sway. The convent, needing continued patronage, would yield. Letters and petitions survive in which prioresses reluctantly agree to let girls go, often expressing regret and concern about the world into which they were returning. Marriage, after all, was no simple exchange. It involved contracts, dowries, and the coordination of kinship networks. And so, girls returning from convents were often rushed into matches that had been arranged quietly in their absence. They arrived home, not to rest, but to prepare. Their linen was packed, their hair grown back, their name entered into new documents. If they objected, their words were often lost beneath layers of duty. One such case occurred in Ghent in 1377, when a girl named Clara van der Broek, aged 16, was removed from her convent after 5 years as a novice. Her older sister had died in childbirth, and Clara was summoned to marry the widowed brother-in-law to keep her dowry within the family. Clara protested. She had already taken the white veil of the novitiate and written a letter expressing her intent to take final vows. But the bishop ruled that her vows were not binding until she had completed her year of probation, and her father's petition succeeded. Clara married the man 4 months later. These stories were not rare. The church allowed leeway in interpreting spiritual commitment. Until final vows were spoken before witnesses, the girl remained, in legal terms, a daughter first and a novice second. For some, this transition proved traumatic. The daily life of a nun was structured and predictable. Prayers at set hours, meals in silence, work in the gardens or scriptorium, spiritual readings, and seasonal observances. A girl trained in that environment might struggle with the noise, expectations, and physicality of secular life. Marriage introduced demands not only on her body, but on her attention and patience. She was expected to bear children, manage servants, tolerate in-laws, and remain cheerful. For those who had spent years learning to sublimate the self through religious devotion, this new role could feel foreign or even hostile. Conversely, some girls embraced the change. Freed from the perpetual caution of cloistered speech and movement, they found joy in conversation, music, and companionship. Their religious training gave them tools for patience, order, and self-discipline, which often served them well in marriage. A letter from a woman named Agatha de Lys to her former prioress praises her monastic years for preparing her to be a wife with peace in her heart and a prayer always ready. Still, the structure of marriage differed profoundly from that of the cloister. In a convent, obedience was spiritual and often communal. In marriage, obedience was hierarchical, anchored in the authority of a husband who might not share her values or treat her gently. A former novice was often more pious than her husband, more literate and more accustomed to daily contemplation. This mismatch could cause quiet strain, especially if the marriage was arranged quickly or served political or financial goals rather than compatibility. For girls from poorer families, convent entry was sometimes the only viable alternative to an unwanted match. Some took refuge behind cloister walls to escape violent or much older suitors. Convents occasionally protected such girls, granting them sanctuary while disputes were resolved. But these protections had limits. Without a dowry portion, their position was always at risk. They might be placed in lesser roles within the convent, doing menial labor or receiving fewer books and comforts. And if family pressure grew strong enough, they could be removed and married off with little warning. In rare cases, girls in these situations disappeared altogether. Chronicles mention girls who ran away from convents to avoid marriage, sometimes hiding with distant relatives or entering the service of unrelated households. The law generally sided with families, and fugitives were pursued, but local sympathy could make enforcement difficult. These girls became living challenges to the system, silent proofs that not every daughter accepted her assigned path. Such resistance was rare, but it existed, and it marked the tension at the heart of the cloister and marriage dynamic. The uneasy truth that medieval girls, caught between two models of submission, could find no space for choice. Whether they lived behind stone walls or under the roof of a husband's house, they moved through systems that weighed their value in dowries, connections, and reputation. And when their will clashed with family expectation, the system was not designed to listen. So when a girl was taken from the quiet paths of the convent garden and led into a house where her name would be changed, her body claimed, and her silence expected, what did she carry with her from the cloister? Did she bring the peace of prayer, or the loss of a life that might have been? For the girls who passed through the convent without ever taking vows, the cloister often remained a quiet ghost in their lives, a past they did not speak of, a rhythm of bells and psalms replaced by the clatter of hearths and the cries of children. They had entered a place that promised spiritual stillness and been called back into the noise and motion of a secular world, expected to forget what they had almost chosen. And most did. They married, they bore children, they managed households. Their religious training, brief or prolonged, made them steady wives, reliable mothers, and capable household heads. They knew how to keep books, observe the calendar of saints, and discipline a household gently but firmly. Their time in the cloister had taught them how to observe without speaking, how to bear discomfort with composure, and how to listen more than they were listened to. But for some, those silent years in the convent were more than a footnote. They were a memory that shaped their inner lives in ways no husband or dowry ever could. Occasionally, in rare documents, we glimpse them reaching back toward that stillness. Letters survive from women who wrote to their former prioresses, asking for prayers, for copies of scriptures, or for guidance in a world that offered no room for spiritual discipline amid the chaos of family life. In one letter from a woman named Allais of Meaux, written around 1393, she confides, "My husband speaks to me with kind respect, yet I miss the silence of the cloister chapel, where I heard my own breath rise with the incense." Another woman, Sibylla of Leuven, sent coin to her old convent yearly, requesting prayers not just for her soul, but for her clarity. These were not acts of rebellion. They were small acknowledgements of a path once glimpsed, a self once imagined. Others, particularly those widowed young, returned to the cloister. In many parts of Europe, it was customary for widows without children, or with grown children, to re-enter religious life. Their entry was often smoother, their spiritual longing viewed more sympathetically. A former novice-turned-wife might be welcomed back with quiet understanding. For these women, the convent became not a way station, but a destination reached at last. A compelling case is that of Benedicta de Narbonne, who had been sent to a convent as a child. removed to marry a merchant, widowed by 30, and returned. To the same convent by 35. She became a scribe and later sub-prioress, eventually overseeing the education of new novices. Her chronicle, discovered in a water-damaged manuscript, contains lines of quiet defiance. My path turned, but not away, only through another gate. Yet most women never returned. The obligations of motherhood, the economics of remarriage, and the ceaseless duties of peasant or noble households meant that the cloister remained a place of memory, not possibility. Some kept small signs of it close, a copied verse, a prayer whispered before sleep, a string of worn beads once gifted by a nun. Others said nothing, burying that former life like a winter root, hidden beneath the snow. There were losses too for the convents. When a girl left, especially after years as a novice, the other sisters sometimes grieved, though the convents were pragmatic institutions, dependent on dowries and closely tied to familial politics. They also developed real communities of faith and friendship. The departure of a beloved girl could leave an emptiness in the choir stalls or among the scribes. A few convents began writing short entries in their ledgers, noting such departures, not in anger, but in muted farewell. In one English convent's record from 1378, a departing novice is described simply, Sister Johanna, not vowed, returned to her house by family request. May peace go with her. These lines, dry but deliberate, remind us that departure was not only legal, but personal. A life begun in service to one order was rerouted, often without ceremony, into service of another. The broader society accepted this movement between cloister and marriage. It was not scandalous, not sinful, not even unusual, but it left women with layered identities that were seldom recognized. A woman who had once worn the veil, even briefly, carried with her a different way of seeing. She had lived in a space shaped by bells and books, by celibacy and contemplation. She had spoken little, listened much, and watched the seasons through iron-grated windows. Those memories could not be erased by the demands of a marital bed or the expectations of a bustling hall. In time, she became indistinguishable from other wives. Her story folded into the daily business of village or manor life. The priest might still recall her former calling during confession, but her children never knew. Her husband might joke once about the quietness she brought into the house, and she might, from time to time, turn her head toward the sound of distant church bells and pause a little longer than necessary. What is clear, though, is that the girls who passed through cloisters before marrying were not just brides delayed. They were women with complex beginnings, touched briefly by a life they did not choose or were not allowed to keep. And so we are left to wonder, what might have changed had they stayed? What might have been born of their prayers, their writing, their quiet wisdom, had they not been summoned from the cloister to the kitchen? And how many of them, standing at the altar with hands folded and eyes downcast, still carried inside them a chapel no one else could see? In the corner of a dimly lit room above a weaver's shop in Rouen, a wooden chest sat beneath the low bed of a 15-year-old girl. Its lid was carved with her initials, A.L., and the year 1389. The chest was modest, made of ash rather, than oak and bound in iron straps. Inside, neatly folded and wrapped in linen, was the sum total of her preparation for marriage. Gowns, chemises, combs, a pair of stockings, and, carefully tucked into one corner, a blue embroidered belt gifted by her aunt, who had worn it on her own wedding day. This chest was her trousseau. In the medieval world, the trousseau was more than a collection of garments or linens. It was a physical symbol of a girl's readiness to become a wife. It was a portable household, a reflection of her family's wealth, and in many cases, a public declaration of her social aspirations. To examine a girl's trousseau was to see her family's investment, her mother's hopes, and the quiet weight of expectation folded into every seam. The word trousseau comes from the Old French trousser, meaning to bundle, and that is precisely what it was, a bundle of possessions, packed and carried to her husband's house upon marriage. But each item in that bundle was chosen with care, often over years, and each had meaning. It was the one part of the marriage process that the bride herself might partially influence, selecting colors, fabrics, or embroidery styles with her mother or older sisters. In this way, It offered a rare moment of agency, even if limited by class and resources. For noble girls, the trousseau was lavish and codified in contracts. Inventory lists from noble households show chests filled with silk gowns, fur-lined cloaks, gold-threaded veils, and fine linen chemises. A noble trousseau might include tablecloths, cushions, devotional books, even silver spoons and cups. These items were not always for the bride's exclusive use. They were household goods, meant to establish her role in the home she was entering. In many cases, the trousseau formed part of the dowry, declared in legal documents and later contested. If disputes arose, for daughters of merchants or artisans, the trousseau was simpler, but no less significant. A wool gown dyed with woad or madder, a pair of boots, a carefully hemmed chemise, and perhaps a small mirror or ivory comb, linen for beds and tables, a set of pots, maybe a woven tapestry or embroidered pillow. Every item was measured not only for use, but for its signal, its declaration that this girl had been prepared, that her family had not sent her away unformed or unfit. Mothers played the central role in preparing the trousseau. Years before the wedding was even discussed, they set aside coin, cloth or thread. They embroidered initials onto pillowcases, set aside bolts of fabric for future gowns, and whispered advice about what to bring and what to leave behind. In poor families, these preparations were piecemeal and often hidden from view. A scrap of fabric might be saved for years, a wooden spoon carved slowly during winter nights. The accumulation of these things was slow, patient, and profoundly meaningful. But the trousseau was also a site of anxiety. For many families, especially those with limited means, assembling an adequate bundle for a daughter was a financial strain. Dowries were hard enough, cash, livestock, or land, but the trousseau had to be visible. It was the bride's first impression, the opening note of her presentation. If it seemed shabby or incomplete, it reflected poorly not just on her, but on her entire family. Girls from poorer households sometimes entered their husbands' homes with only a blanket and a single gown. These trousseaux were rarely recorded, but their absence was noted, silently, socially. In cities, the trousseau was often displayed before the wedding. Neighbors, friends, and relatives would be invited to inspect the chest. The bride's family would lay out linens, hang dresses from beams, and set out jewelry or cosmetics on small tables. This public viewing was both celebration and inspection. Guests would praise the quality of the fabric, the brightness of the dye, or the craftsmanship of embroidery. But beneath the compliments, there was judgment. Was the cloth coarse or fine? Were the undergarments plentiful or sparse? Did the colors suggest modesty, affluence, or ambition? For the girl herself, the trousseau could be a quiet burden. It was a list of expectations disguised as a gift. Each item whispered its own instruction. This is how you must dress, how you must host, how you must live. A well-stocked trousseau suggested she would be a competent housekeeper. A collection of devotional items signaled piety. A lack of wool or undergarments implied neglect or future hardship. And then there were the things that could not be packed. The knowledge passed from mother to daughter about how to fold sheets, how to mend socks, how to smooth a linen tablecloth without leaving wrinkles. These skills, though not visible in the chest, were assumed to accompany it. The trousseau was only part of the preparation. The rest was stored in memory and muscle. Sometimes, girls never used their trousseau. If a marriage fell through, the chest remained in the family home, a mute presence. In one documented case from Aragon, a girl's wedding was cancelled after the groom's sudden death, and her trousseau was kept intact, unopened for 10 years. It was eventually given to her younger sister, who married a different man. The original owner never wed. Other times, the chest travelled far. Girls married into households hundreds of miles away, carrying their bundles on carts or by hand. The trousseau, in such cases, became a link to home, a reminder of origin, of continuity, of identity. In households where the bride was unfamiliar or unwelcome, it was sometimes her only comfort. And then, of course, there were items of quiet rebellion, a hidden scrap of writing, a ring not given by her father, a secret keepsake folded beneath layers of linen. Not every object in the trousseau had been chosen by others. Some were chosen by the girl herself, small tokens of autonomy, easily overlooked but fiercely kept. So when a young bride stood in the doorway of her husband's home with her trousseau, chest carried behind her, what did she feel? Did she worry about the impression it would make? Did she wonder if her gown was bright enough, her linens smooth enough, her veil properly folded? Did she long for one more glance at the familiar room where it had been packed? And once inside, when the chest was finally opened and the contents laid bare, was she judged only by what she brought or by what others expected her to become? The contents of a medieval bride's trousseau were as much about expectation as they were about necessity. A gown was not just clothing, it was a statement of station. A tablecloth was not merely functional, it implied her readiness to run a proper household. A comb, a mirror, a length of dyed ribbon, each spoke silently to the status and decorum that would now be demanded of her. And so, every piece tucked into that chest came with a quiet weight, a measurement not only of what the girl would carry, but what she was now expected to become. Among the wealthier classes, particularly the merchant elite of Italian and French cities, trousseaux were extensively itemized in legal records. Inventories were written up by notaries as part of the marriage. Contracts. These lists give us astonishing detail: 12 linen chemises, 8 woolen gowns, 4 for feast days, 4 for ordinary wear, a fur-lined mantle, 3 pairs of shoes, a dozen embroidered napkins, 1 mirror framed in brass, and sometimes even a small hand-washing basin. These inventories were attached to dowry contracts, and in some cities like Florence or Genoa, held legal force in case of marital dispute or widowhood. In such households, assembling the trousseau began early. Cloth was bought in bulk when prices were good. Embroidery was done in spare hours between harvest and winter. Mothers worked alongside daughters, sometimes with hired seamstresses. A daughter's trousseau became a slow labor, sewn into family time. A father might bring home imported linen from a trade voyage, or have a shoemaker set aside a particularly fine pair of slippers for the coming marriage. Over months and years, the trousseau grew, not just a bundle of objects, but a reflection of care, pride, and reputation. But for those of more modest means, the trousseau was often assembled hastily and with great strain. In rural villages, a single wool gown might serve for both wedding and ordinary days. Chemises were carefully patched from older linens. A mother might unpick her own veil and rework it for her daughter. If the family had no livestock or goods to spare for the dowry, the trousseau itself became the only material sign of the girl's value, every stitch carrying the hope that it would suffice. The trousseau also carried risk. Should the marriage dissolve, or if the husband died shortly? After the wedding, questions of ownership became complicated. In many places, the trousseau was legally considered part of the wife's property and had to be returned to her or her family. But in practice, these items often disappeared into the household, used by other family members or quietly sold. Legal. Disputes over trousseau appear in records throughout Europe. Mothers petitioning for the return of linens, brothers suing for the recovery of their sister's bridal mantle, even priests arbitrating over whether a cooking pot counted as dowry, property or not. There were also social perils. In cities, trousseau became something of a competition. Families not only wanted their daughters to marry well, they wanted to be seen as respectable, generous, and prepared. A girl whose trousseau was lacking risked being mocked, not only by her husband's family, but by neighbors and friends. Rumors would spread. A guest at the wedding feast might mention, too loudly, that the linens were thin or the seams uneven. These criticisms would follow the girl long after the ceremony, whispered each time she hosted a meal or walked into the parish chapel. And yet, some girls subverted this expectation. In one record from Bruges, a bride named Lisbeth chose to forgo the traditional trousseau display. Her family, recently bankrupted, could not afford the usual feast and linen show. Instead, Lisbeth arrived at her husband's home with a single chest containing 3 well-made gowns, a psalter, and a pair of wooden shoes carved by her younger brother. She explained to her in-laws, with a calmness noted in the family's chronicles, that she had brought what is needed and nothing more. Over time, she became known for her stewardship of household resources and her generosity toward village women in childbirth, far more enduring traits than any silk veil might have shown. Still, the trousseau remained a burden for many families. A third daughter might receive a reduced set of linens. A family with no sons might pour all remaining wealth into a single trousseau, hoping it would attract a respectable match that would bring security for all. Sometimes sisters pooled their items, sharing undergarments, splitting up family cloth. There are recorded cases of trousseau being leased between cousins, temporarily transferred for a ceremony, then quietly returned before the bride's departure. The line between pride and necessity was often painfully thin, and of course, there was the invisible labor behind every garment. Every linen sheet had been spun, woven, and hemmed by hand. Every embroidered letter on a pillowcase was the work of tired fingers, often guided by a mother's correction. Girls learned not only to wear their trousseau, but to replicate them, to repair, re-sew, even pass them on. The skills of maintenance were just as essential as the initial display. In that sense, the trousseau was less a gift than a trial. It said, "You are now a household keeper. This is your burden to carry, launder, and protect." Even the containers mattered. The chest itself, its wood, its carvings, its lock, spoke volumes. In some parts of France and Italy, trousseau chests became family heirlooms, reused across generations. Others were burned if the marriage ended in scandal. One English woman, after a bitter widowhood, famously had her daughter's trousseau chest destroyed and replaced with a plain box, so no cursed hope of fortune should cling to it. And then there were the absences. Some girls married with no trousseau at all. These stories are harder to find, buried in silence or shame, but they existed. Girls married in borrowed clothes. They entered homes with nothing. Their value was presumed to be in their obedience, their humility, their usefulness. These brides were the most vulnerable, without property, without display, without the shield of preparation, and yet even they found ways to carve space for themselves, to sew scraps into something lasting. So the next time we read of a medieval marriage, of a girl described simply as brought to her husband's house with her goods, we must ask, what was in that chest? What was not? And what silent stories were folded into the corners of linen no one ever saw? Once the trousseau chest had crossed the threshold of the husband's household and been placed in its designated corner, usually at the foot of the bed or against the chamber wall, the items it held took on a new life. They were no longer part of a display or a family offering. They were now tools. The finely woven tablecloths would be spread for feast days, the chemises laundered and mended, the cloaks worn against the cold morning air as the new wife stepped into her duties. With each use, the items in the chest began to fade, wear, fray, and tell stories. These items, however humble or grand, were never just fabric. They were markers of transition. The wool gowns stained with broth, the pillowcases worn thin by restless children, the veils snagged on the edge of a cart, all bore witness to a girl's slow transformation into a wife, a housekeeper, a mother. In time, she herself might come, to see the chest not as a symbol of hope, but as a reminder of how much she had changed. Some trousseaux were proudly maintained. Women who had received generous or well-made items sometimes displayed them anew at festivals or family gatherings. In noble households, it was common to rotate bedding or garments for special visitors, and older trousseau pieces might reappear to impress guests or to demonstrate that the bride had fulfilled her duties of stewardship. Linen and wool that had lasted well was spoken of admiringly. She's a careful keeper of cloth, neighbors might say. But for many women, the trousseau also became a source of quiet frustration. These items, once lovingly prepared and folded, wore out quickly under daily use. A woman who had begun marriage with 6 gowns might find herself down to 2 within 5 years. Sheets tore, towels vanished, combs cracked, and replacing these, goods often fell on the woman herself, even if she had brought them into the marriage. This slow unraveling created new pressures. Some husbands resented being asked to provide replacements, especially if they felt the trousseau had been overly modest to begin with. Others used the depletion of the trousseau as a reason to criticize their wives' housekeeping. A frayed hem or a stained towel could become ammunition in household quarrels. You came with poor goods and can't keep them fit. The trousseau, intended as a beginning, became a lingering benchmark against which a woman's success or failure was measured. Still, many women adapted. They dyed worn fabrics to hide stains, reworked undergarments into children's clothes, or cut down feast gowns into aprons. In this way, the trousseau became a living thing, altered, repurposed, layered with use. Some women recorded these adaptations in household books, alongside notes on spinning, mending, and storage. In wealthier homes, such books became family guides, passed down through generations, and indeed, many trousseaux were reused. If a daughter inherited her mother's chest, she might receive not only garments, but tools. Scissors dulled with time, combs worn smooth, thimbles bent from years of use. These items carried stories too. They were worn, but also softened. In some cases, grandmothers passed down bridal veils. Their original colors faded, but the stitching still intact. Such heirlooms were often mentioned in wills or passed with. Quiet ceremony from one woman to another, linking generations in thread and fiber. Sometimes, items were kept out of use entirely. A particularly fine chemise might be saved for burial. A candle holder from the trousseau placed near a deathbed. These choices reflect how deeply material goods were tied to memory, to meaning. The trousseau was not merely a start, it was a presence throughout life. In towns, second-hand trousseau became a kind of quiet economy. When marriages ended or girls died young, their chests were sometimes sold at market. Buyers knew the value of well-made cloth, and there was no shame in purchasing a gown that had once belonged to a noble bride. A small shop in Dijon specialized in widow's linen, unused or scarcely worn pieces from failed marriages. Women browsed through folded stacks that had once been wrapped in joy and hope, now offered in silence. In these exchanges, we glimpse a practical truth. The symbolism faded, but the fabric remained useful. There were darker chapters too. In times of famine or war, trousseaux were pawned. A wedding belt might be traded for flour, a silver clasp for firewood. These transactions, sometimes recorded in parish records, offer heartbreaking detail. Item: 1 linen shift, white with red stitching, given for a bushel of rye. These notes are all that remain of some women's only possessions, their chests emptied to keep their children alive. And yet, across all these stories, the trousseau endures as a strangely enduring thread in the history of medieval marriage. It was both ordinary and sacred. It bore love and labor. It weighed heavy, not in gold, but in meaning. Because what a girl packed was never just clothing. It was a blueprint of her future. It was the stitched echo of her mother's voice, the careful tuck of a sister's hand, the pressed wax seal of her father's coin. It was a hope, heavy in a wooden box, that she might be welcomed, valued, and remembered. And even as the garments wore thin, the expectation remained that what she brought would somehow become enough. But what happened when it wasn't? When the trousseau disappointed, or when it disappeared, through fire, theft, or fate? What did a woman cling to when the last thread of her preparation had frayed? In a parish church outside of Ghent, sometime in the year 1321, a young girl stood in front of a priest. Her hands were folded, her head bowed. Her father stood beside her, speaking for her, and across from her stood a boy barely older, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. The priest cleared his throat, asked if both parties consented to the union. The boy answered in a firm voice. The girl's response came barely above a whisper. It might have been yes. It might have been nothing. The priest took it as agreement. The congregation murmured prayers. The marriage was done. In medieval Europe, consent was the cornerstone of lawful Christian marriage, at least in theory. The church had declared, as early as the 12th century, that consensus facit nuptias, consent makes the marriage. This rule distinguished Christian marriage from other traditions. No dowry or ceremony was legally required if both parties, of legal age, freely gave verbal consent to marry each other. A simple exchange of words, "I take you as mine," could bind two people for life. And yet, in practice, especially for girls, consent was rarely simple. It was shaped by silence, expectation, and pressure so subtle that the words themselves, if spoken, often meant little. Girls of marriageable age, usually 12 or older, were expected to say yes, but they were also expected not to resist. Silence was often taken as agreement, especially in front of priests or family elders. A girl who spoke up forcefully risked shaming her parents, insulting her prospective husband, or even losing the marriage entirely, and with it, her chance for future security. Saying no was not impossible, it was just unthinkable. In many households, a girl was told of her impending marriage only days in advance. She might be allowed to speak to the groom in the presence of chaperones. She might be asked gently if she was willing, but the question was rarely open-ended. It came embedded in ritual, wrapped in expectations. A father might say, "He is a good man, and you will honor us by accepting him." A mother might add, "You'll be safe, fed, and have children of your own." And the girl, knowing what had been arranged on her behalf, would nod. There are recorded cases of girls refusing. One from the court records of Poitiers tells of a girl named Ismay who ran away rather than marry her uncle's favored match. She was found in a convent 2 weeks later and eventually persuaded to return. Her second marriage, arranged a year later, went forward without further resistance. Ismay's story survives because it disrupted the process. Most girls who accepted their fate leave no such trace. In some places, especially in rural communities, consent was barely a formal step at all. Marriages were arranged at the family level, between fathers, brothers, uncles. A priest was called, only to bless the union. The girl might stand silently throughout, performing her role without speaking, her body language interpreted by the adults around her. If she cried, it was taken as nerves. If she trembled, as modesty. Only in extreme cases, shouting, running away, or public refusal, would her behavior be seen as dissent. And yet, church law insisted that consent must be present. Canon lawyers debated the conditions of a valid yes. Could a whispered consent count? Was consent under pressure valid? What if the girl had not been informed of the match in advance? These questions filled legal treatises and sermon examples. But in daily life, the answers remained murky. Some priests, concerned about the morality of such unions, began insisting on hearing the consent clearly, separately from each party. Others turned a blind eye. After all, the family's honor was at stake, and a hesitant bride was hardly unusual. The ceremony was public, and so long as no one objected loudly, the marriage proceeded. Among the nobility, where marriages were highly strategic, consent was often treated as ceremonial fiction. A girl might be married by proxy, her groom represented by a stand-in if he lived far away. She might not see him until the wedding night. In such cases, consent was given through a letter or through a parent's word. While technically allowed under church law if the girl later agreed, the practice pushed the meaning of consent to its limit. And then there were secret marriages, clandestine unions formed by the couple without family approval. These were especially common among lower gentry and urban classes. A girl and boy, fearing family disapproval, might exchange vows privately before witnesses, then live together or seek a priest's blessing afterward. Such marriages were legally valid if both were of age, and the vows were mutual and voluntary, but they caused chaos, disputed inheritances, feuds, and social scandal. Families sometimes accused priests of encouraging such unions. Church councils periodically tried to ban them, but love, lust, and desperation often found their way around rules. For girls, secret marriages were double-edged. They offered a sliver of agency, a way to choose, but they also exposed them to risk. A boy might break his promise, claim the words were never said. The girl might be left pregnant, unwed, and disgraced. Records from ecclesiastical courts are filled with cases where women tried to prove that a promise of marriage had been made. Without witnesses or a written contract, they often lost. Even within formal marriage, the ambiguity of consent lingered. A woman might later claim she had been coerced. She might seek annulment, citing fear or pressure. Some courts accepted these claims, especially if the woman was still young or the marriage unconsummated. Others dismissed them, pointing to public participation or the presence of witnesses. Silence, once mistaken for agreement, became difficult to challenge. And so, the medieval girl's yes was more often a performance than a declaration. It was spoken or not, within a structure that left little room for dissent. Her assent was assumed by those who needed it, and her hesitation, if noticed, was rarely given meaning. Still, we are left with questions. How many girls stood before the altar with clenched hands, hearts pounding, uncertain of what they were promising? How many said yes with voices that no one truly listened to? And if we were to go back and hear those ceremonies again, not just the words spoken, but the silences, what might we understand about the weight behind that single simple word? It was not enough for a medieval girl to say yes. She had to say it in the right way, at the right time, with the right demeanor. Her tone, her posture, even the tilt of her eyes, all were observed, interpreted, and whispered about. In public, she was expected to embody quiet acceptance, to nod modestly during the ceremony, and to bow her head afterward. Too much enthusiasm was suspect, too much reluctance, disruptive. A proper bride knew how to appear agreeable without seeming eager. This performance was not simply for the groom's benefit. It was for the family, the community, the priest, and the legal structure that sanctioned the marriage. Consent, though essential in theory, had become ritualized, flattened into a gesture that preserved social order. And girls, trained from early childhood to serve family honor, understood that the wrong gesture could ruin everything. The public wedding ceremony, usually held outside the church doors before moving inside for the nuptial mass, was a communal event. Villagers, neighbors, and relatives gathered to watch not just the union, but the demeanor of the bride. Gossip often began before the vows were even finished. She looked pale. She didn't smile. She flinched when he touched her hand. These were not idle comments. They were potential threats to the legitimacy of the union, especially if disputes arose later. Priests, aware of this pressure, often tried to coax clear consent. In some regions, they began asking the bride directly, repeating the question until an audible answer was given. But this created tension. Families disliked the implication that the girl's answer was not already known. Fathers bristled at repeated questions. In some places, girls were quietly coached on how to say yes with conviction, firm enough to satisfy the priest, but gentle enough to appear modest. In legal theory, consent could not be coerced. But where was the line between pressure and persuasion? Was a girl free to say no if her father had negotiated the match, if her dowry had been prepared, if the guests were already assembled and the priest had traveled from another parish? To say no in such a setting was not just personal rebellion, it was social disruption, and few had the courage or protection to take such a step. Sometimes girls tried to resist in subtler ways: a limp handshake, a downcast gaze, an unexplained illness. In a few cases, these small protests delayed the ceremony. A bride-to-be in Avignon once claimed sudden laryngitis on her wedding day. Her father, believing she had been cursed, postponed the marriage for weeks. Eventually, she recovered her voice and agreed to the match. Whether she had ever truly lost it remains unclear. There were also legal tools available, though rarely used. A girl could appeal to the bishop's court, claiming she had been forced into marriage or that her consent had been misunderstood. If the marriage had not yet been consummated, an annulment might be granted. But such appeals required courage, knowledge, and often the support of sympathetic clergy, conditions not easily met. Most girls who felt trapped had no avenue of escape. In noble circles, the situation was even more complex. Political marriages often involved girls who were betrothed as children and married as adolescents. Their roles were symbolic, tokens, of treaties, alliances, and inheritance claims. A princess marrying a foreign duke was expected to agree with grace, even if she had never met the man. Her consent was often given through letters, dictated by tutors or guardians. Her willingness was presumed. These brides were displayed as gifts, their bodies wrapped in silk and ceremony. Their real voice, if it existed, was buried under layers of diplomacy and expectation. Among the lower classes, where marriages were less about politics and more about practicality, the illusion of choice was sometimes stronger. A girl might know her future husband from childhood. Their families might negotiate gently, allowing her some input. But even then, her role was shaped by what her parents considered reasonable. A girl who refused a match too forcefully could be labeled disobedient. Her future options might narrow, and if she loved someone deemed unsuitable, poor, landless, from another village, her preferences were almost certainly dismissed. Still, some chose love over arrangement. There are cases of girls eloping, of clandestine marriages formed without parental approval. In England, These were known as spousals by mutual consent. Church law recognized them if both parties were of age and willing, but they carried risks. Families could disown the couple, dowries could be withheld, and in many cases, the bride bore the consequences alone, especially if the groom reneged. One haunting example comes from a court in Siena in 1355, where a young woman named Benedetta claimed she had exchanged vows with a man who later denied it. She brought 2 witnesses who testified to the words spoken. The man insisted it had been a joke. The court ruled against her. She was declared unmarried and, having admitted to consummation, effectively dishonored. Cases like Benedetta's reveal the fragility of spoken consent. In a world without written contracts or recorded vows, memory and reputation became the battleground. A girl's whispered yes or her silence could define her fate, and if challenged, she often had little power to defend it. And yet, consent was not only about law or ritual, it was also about inner resolve. Some girls accepted their marriages, quietly, believing it their duty. Others made peace with their role over time. A few found contentment or even affection in unexpected places. But many lived with a dissonance between the life they were told to want and the one they privately imagined. We do not hear their voices directly, but we can sense them in the petitions to bishops, in the runaway cases, in the letters that survive from nuns and widows reflecting on lives not fully chosen. And so we must ask, when a girl's consent was shaped by silence, what did her yes truly mean? Was it agreement, acquiescence, or simply the only word allowed? Once the wedding ceremony was complete, once the feast ended and the guests returned to their homes, the question of consent was seldom revisited. The bride, now wife, was expected to take her place without further hesitation. Her duties awaited, domestic, sexual, spiritual. Her willingness was assumed and her role no longer questioned. The yes, however faint or uncertain, had been spoken or implied. What followed was treated as a natural consequence. For many medieval girls, this meant a swift shift into adult responsibilities. Even if they were barely 14 or 15, they were now expected to manage servants, cook, mend, bear children, and maintain a household. In wealthier homes, they oversaw more than they touched, giving orders, keeping accounts, writing letters. But the expectation of performance remained constant. No further affirmation was needed. The one word said before the altar had spoken, for a lifetime. The church, so insistent on the importance of consent at the moment of marriage, showed little interest in how that consent might evolve. A woman who regretted her marriage, who grew unhappy or afraid, found few avenues for recourse. Divorce, as understood today, did not exist in medieval Christendom. Annulments were possible, but difficult to secure. The criteria were specific: consanguinity, too closely related; impotence, prior vows of celibacy; lack of consent at the time of marriage; or non-consummation. Proving any of these required evidence, witnesses, and, in most cases, a great deal of influence. And so, most women lived within the confines of marriages that began with a nod or a whisper. Some made peace with it, others endured. A few, the fortunate or the stubborn, carved out autonomy within their limited bounds. There were ways to push back, quiet, indirect, often risky. Some women withheld affection or cooperation. Some manipulated the expectations of piety, claiming illness or spiritual withdrawal. A few turned to the church, not for legal escape, but for personal solace. Confessors, sympathetic priests, or local nuns might offer emotional refuge or practical advice. But the law remained clear. Once the yes was spoken and the union consummated, the marriage was indissoluble. Even in the face of abuse, the church urged reconciliation. A husband might be chastised by his confessor. A wife might be told to pray, to obey, to endure. A separation of bed and board could sometimes be granted, allowing the couple to live apart. But such cases were rare and often required evidence of extreme harm. Still, a few voices broke through. In York in the late 1300s, a woman named Elena sought annulment from her husband, citing forced consent. She claimed her family had threatened her and that she had never spoken the words willingly. The case went to the Archbishop's court. Surprisingly, after months of testimony, the marriage was annulled. Elena returned to her family, though her Prospects for remarriage were permanently damaged. The court record ends there. We do not know what became of her, only that her resistance, rare and brave, was momentarily heard. More commonly, women found themselves caught between expectation and reality. Their yes had set everything in motion, and though they might never be asked again, they were reminded constantly, by law, by church, by community, that they had agreed, that this life, however difficult, was the one they had chosen. The implications were far-reaching. A woman could not refuse her husband conjugal rights. Theologians taught that marriage protected against lust, but it also meant that a wife's body was no longer entirely her own. Refusal was frowned upon and could be grounds for criticism or even legal complaint. And so the idea of consent, once so carefully invoked at the start, became irrelevant in daily practice. The same applied to economic and domestic matters. A married woman could not make contracts without her husband's approval. Her labor, her dowry, and her children belonged to the household, not to her. The initial yes was treated as a permanent surrender of independent will, a legal and moral transaction with no expiry. Yet in private, the story may have been different. In letters, poems, and devotional writings, medieval women sometimes hinted at their inner lives. A prayer written by a married woman in the 14th century begins, "Lord, let me serve with love, not just with duty." Another fragment found in a prayer book reads, "My hands work for others, but my soul kneels alone." These lines, tucked between psalms and recipes, reveal a quiet yearning, a wish that obedience and affection might someday align. Others turn to the Virgin Mary, whose life was often held up as a model for pious womanhood. Mary too had once said yes, "Fiat mihi secundum verbum tuum," "Let it be done to me according to your word." Medieval women were taught to emulate her acceptance, her silence, her service. But they also saw in her a figure of strength, endurance, and hidden wisdom. In Mary's quiet, they found reflection. In her suffering, kinship. Over time, the yes a girl had once given, barely heard, perhaps half understood, grew into something else. It became a rhythm, a habit, a part of her speech. It shaped how she taught her daughters, how she advised her neighbors, how she managed her household. Whether it had begun as willingness or resignation, it became the frame through which she moved. And at the end of her life, perhaps surrounded by grandchildren or alone in a darkened chamber, she might have looked back and wondered what that first answer had truly meant. Had it been her own? Had she spoken it for herself or for the family gathered around her? Did it matter? The chronicles do not say, but somewhere in the pause before the priest's question and in the breath just before she answered, something of her still lingers. She was 14, or maybe 12, or perhaps she had just turned 15 the week before the ships arrived. Her name was mentioned only once in the chronicles, usually paired with her father's title. She did not speak in public. She had been trained to walk with grace, to bow with precision, to smile with restraint. When the envoys came, she stood still while they examined her posture and teeth. And when they left, her marriage had been decided. She would be sent to a foreign court, married to a king, or to the boy who would become one. Her job was not to choose, but to fulfill. In medieval Europe, royal and noble marriages were never just about two people. They were treaties in fabric and flesh, contracts woven from bloodlines and borders. Kings married daughters of rivals to secure peace, bind alliances, or legitimize claims. Dukes and counts offered their sisters as gifts to higher lords. Princesses became currency. Their beauty, virtue, and fertility were evaluated alongside the size of their dowries. Their childhoods were shaped not by games or learning, but by grooming for distant courts. The girl herself had little say. Even among nobility, consent was a formality handled on her behalf. At best, she was told politely. At worst, she found out after the deal had been signed. Take Margaret of Scotland. At 12, she was promised to the King of Norway. Her marriage treaty included clauses about shipping grain between ports and terms for how many ladies-in-waiting would travel with her. She was expected to learn Norwegian customs, bear children quickly, and support her husband's rule. Her yes came through scribes and envoys. She was shipped like cargo, a royal daughter, traded for stability, or consider Blanche of Castile, who became Queen of France. Her betrothal was arranged when she was barely out of infancy. She was sent to France at 12, married shortly after, and crowned queen before her voice had deepened. Blanche, unusually intelligent and devout, later wielded considerable power as regent, but her path to that power had been chosen long before she could understand it. These were not isolated cases. Across the kingdoms of Europe, girls were trained, from birth, to become diplomatic offerings. They learned languages, court customs, and how to carry themselves during public ceremonies. Their marriages were discussed in chancelleries and ratified in cathedrals. They were received with trumpets, veils, and processions. But behind the spectacle lay duty, not desire. And what of the days leading up to departure? In most cases, the bride left her family forever. A journey across sea or mountains was no small thing. She might never see her mother again, or her childhood nurse, or the familiar chapel where she had learned her first prayers. Her retinue, ladies, guards, and clerics, were often chosen by the groom's family. Even her possessions were carefully inspected. Anything too foreign, too costly, or too sentimental might be left behind. She traveled as an ambassador of peace, but she arrived as a stranger. At the foreign court, the bride's arrival was both celebrated and scrutinized. Her clothes, her accent, her skin tone, even her appetite, everything was noted. If she smiled too freely, she was called frivolous. If she remained reserved, she was called proud. She walked a narrow path, balancing expectations with grace. Her chief purpose was to produce heirs. Quickly, consummation was sometimes verified by witnesses or physical tokens, such as blood-stained sheets. In extreme cases, a public display of the wedding bed or confirmation by midwives was required. For a girl barely into puberty, these expectations were daunting, yet they were part of the role she had been raised to accept. Not all political brides were powerless. Some adapted quickly and gained influence. Eleanor of Aquitaine, married first to the King of France and later to the King of England, became a formidable political force. Others, like Isabella of France, grew into their authority over time, though often at great personal cost. But many remained silent, their voices lost behind the veil of dynastic politics. Their names appear briefly in treaties or birth records, only to vanish after they had produced the required children. Some died young, worn out by childbirth or grief. Others were sent to convents if they failed to conceive. A few returned home, disgraced and replaced by newer alliances. Their lives were shaped not by choice, but by necessity. Even so, behind the formality of royal marriages, there were moments of quiet resistance. A princess might delay her wedding by claiming illness. She might negotiate for better terms, more, ladies-in-waiting, greater religious freedom, or a clause that protected her property rights. Occasionally, she succeeded. More often, her requests were softened and ignored. One young noblewoman, promised to a much older foreign prince, reportedly faked a seizure before her departure, hoping to appear unfit for marriage. Her plan failed. The court physician declared her spirit touched but sound, and she was sent on her way within the week. So what did it mean to say yes when the alternative was unthinkable? When the path had already been paved in silver coin and ecclesiastical Latin? Royal brides were trained not only to consent, but to do so beautifully, to make their compliance graceful, memorable, and palatable, to smile during the procession, to bow before strangers, to answer questions in a language not their own, to nod, not tremble, on their wedding night. And behind that elegance, what was felt? Excitement, fear, resignation, hope. Perhaps all of them at once, because even for a girl promised to a king, the silence behind her yes echoed long after the feast ended.